On the morning of Tuesday, October 19th, emergency services received a distress call. Marta was missing. Her phone was off, and no one could reach her. Northamptonshire police responded swiftly. Officers were dispatched to her address on Wood Street. Officially, it was listed as a welfare check, a routine step when someone is reported missing. But even before they stepped inside, officers sensed this wasn't a routine call. The house was silent. No signs of life. No response at the door. Following standard protocol, and with Marta's family growing increasingly concerned, the police made the decision to force entry. What they found inside was deeply unsettling. In that quiet room, officers made a grim discovery. Marta was there. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Marta Chmielecka was born in 1990. She was a vibrant force, full of color, kindness, and unshakable independence. Her life left a lasting imprint on everyone she met, from childhood friends to strangers she helped without a second thought. Marta's story began in Bydgoszcz, a lively and historic city nestled in northern Poland, known for its scenic rivers, bustling markets, and close-knit neighborhoods where everyone knew each other by name. From a young age, she stood out, not because she demanded attention, but because she radiated a natural warmth that quietly drew people in. Her family, who adored her deeply, often described her as exceptional in every sense of the word. She had a spark, a kind of light that made people want to be near her. She was known for her bright smile, which seemed to appear effortlessly, and her unshakable optimism that lifted others when they were down. Whether it was helping a neighbor carry grocery up a flight of stairs or spending an entire afternoon catching up with an old friend over coffee, Marta had a rare gift. She made people feel seen and heard. Marta's brother and sister-in-law often said she was the glue that held the family together. She never waited to be asked. She just acted. She'd show up when someone needed her, instinctively knowing how to help, whether through a kind word, a home-cooked meal, or simply her reassuring presence. She had a way of making burdens feel lighter just by being there. Back in Poland, Marta shared a particularly close bond with her parents, especially her father. Friends affectionately called her a daddy's girl, but not in a cliched or materialistic sense. Theirs was a bond rooted in quiet strength, mutual respect, and deep affection. Marta would call him just to share the little details of her day, and he would always listen intently, proud of the woman she was becoming. These daily conversations were not just habits. They were lifelines, symbols of their enduring connection even as Marta grew more independent. Her love didn't stop with her parents. Marta absolutely cherished her role as an aunt to her brother's young daughters. She poured herself into that relationship with joy and sincerity. She would often arrive with small gifts tucked into her purse, a coloring book, a soft toy, or just their favorite candy. But what mattered most was her time. She'd kneel on the floor to play board games, braid their hair, or simply listen as they told stories about their day at school. She made each child feel like they were the most important person in the world. Her family would often say that Marta had a natural gentleness, the kind of presence that made you feel safe, valued, and genuinely loved. In her mid-20s, while still living in Poland, Marta's path crossed with someone who would change her life, Paweł Chmielecka. Paweł was a few years older, with a confident air and a deep passion for cars, particularly BMWs, which he treated like prized possessions. At first glance, they seemed to complement each other perfectly. Marta, with her spirited, open-hearted nature, was drawn to Paweł's quieter confidence. Friends would later recall how well they seemed to fit together, laughing during walks, exchanging music playlists, and planning future getaways with wide-eyed enthusiasm. They bonded over shared dreams, dreams of travel, opportunity, and building something bigger than themselves. Paweł spoke often of wanting to explore life outside of Poland, and Marta, always curious and courageous, found that desire deeply appealing. The relationship moved quickly. Within a couple of years, they were ready to take a step that many couples dream of, but few approach with such determination. On July 29, 2016, Marta and Pavel were married in a small but joyful ceremony in Bydgoszcz. The wedding reflected Marta's values, meaningful, heartfelt, and rooted in family. Surrounded by loved ones, with traditional Polish customs and a feast of local dishes, the day was filled with genuine happiness. Marta's father, beaming with pride, watched as his daughter stepped into this new chapter of life. It was a day of celebration, laughter, and hope. The newlyweds began their life together in familiar surroundings. They rented an apartment in Bydgoszcz and settled into a routine. Marta, ever the homemaker, took pride in making their space feel warm and welcoming. For a time, life seemed aligned with their vision. A stable, affectionate relationship with dreams still very much alive. But Marta and Pavel weren't content to stay still for long. They both felt the pull of opportunity beyond Poland's borders, a longing for new experiences, broader horizons, and greater financial stability. After thoughtful conversations and with the encouragement of Marta's brother, who had already relocated, they made a bold decision. In 2017, they left Poland behind and moved to England, settling in the modest but welcoming town of Kettering in Northamptonshire. The decision wasn't easy. Tearful goodbyes were exchanged at the airport. Promises were made to call every day. But Marta, true to her resilient spirit, approached the change with optimism. This wasn't just a relocation. It was the beginning of a new chapter filled with hope. Kettering, with its quiet streets, local cafes, and a growing Polish community, quickly began to feel like a second home. Marta found work and started building a new circle of friends. She embraced her new life wholeheartedly. She and Pavel spent weekends exploring their surroundings, hosting family dinners, and discovering the little joys of their adopted town. Her nieces would visit, and Marta, as always, was ready with games, treats, and stories. Social media posts from those early months painted a picture of contentment. Smiling faces, captions about adventure, and photos of cozy evenings out. On the surface, things looked good. The move had initially brought them closer. Shared challenges, finding work, adjusting to a new culture, gave them purpose and unity. Marta, known for her adaptability and warmth, made it look easy. She built friendships, thrived at her job, and kept in touch with her family back home. But as time passed, subtle but troubling changes began to emerge in her relationship with Pavel. Pavel, who had once seemed quietly confident, began displaying a more controlling side. It started with small things. Questions about where she was going, who she was seeing, or how long she'd be out. At first, Marta brushed it off, thinking it was just adjustment stress or cultural change. But the pattern deepened. His inquiries became more persistent, more pointed, and less about curiosity and more about control. Marta, who had always valued her independence, began to feel the walls closing in. She loved deeply, but she also believed in personal freedom, in the right to grow, explore, and be trusted. As Pavel's behavior shifted, Marta quietly wrestled with how to respond. She didn't want to give up on the life they were building. As the months quietly gave way to years, what had once appeared to be a passionate partnership between Marta Chmielecka and Pavel Chmielecki began to shift. Slowly, and then with unsettling speed. Pavel's protectiveness, once seen as concern, gradually turned into something more consuming. His jealousy wasn't fleeting. It grew like ivy, creeping into every corner of their shared life. Marta's social circle in Kettering's Polish community was expanding, and she was thriving, meeting new people and rediscovering her confidence. Her laughter became more frequent, her social calendar fuller. She was finally regaining the voice that had grown quiet during the more difficult stretches of her marriage. But as Marta's world expanded, Pavel's tolerance shrank. He struggled, not just with the move or with adapting to a new culture, but with Marta's independence. The more she found herself, the more he seemed to lose his sense of control. He began texting her obsessively, his tone shifting from curious to demanding. At times, he would arrive uninvited at locations where Marta was meeting friends, insisting on explanations for her whereabouts. What once might have seemed like an over-attentive spouse now carried the weight of something more alarming. A man grappling with his own inability to let go. Those closest to Marta began to see subtle yet unmistakable changes. Her spark, once unmistakable, dimmed in Pavel's presence. She would smile, yes, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Friends described her as distracted, cautious, sometimes even anxious. When they gently asked if everything was all right, Marta, ever loyal and private, would wave it off. Pavel was just under pressure, she'd say. He was adjusting. He didn't mean harm. But in private conversations with her family, Marta began to open up more candidly. She admitted that things had changed, and not for the better. Her family later revealed that she had expressed growing discomfort about Pavel's behavior. She was not afraid to speak her truth, but she was still hopeful that the situation could be resolved peacefully. Court records would later document 3 significant incidents involving Pavel. One in August 2020, another around Easter 2021, and a third in September 2021. Each instance, taken on its own, might have seemed manageable. But together they painted a pattern. One marked by tension, fear, and a woman trying to preserve her autonomy in the face of mounting pressure. Marta had always been strong-willed, resilient, bright, and capable. But by this point, she no longer recognized the man she had once married. She shared these thoughts with close friends, expressing confusion, disappointment, and yes, fear. Still, she remained, perhaps out of hope, perhaps out of a sense of duty, or perhaps because walking away from a life once built together is never as simple as it seems. But Pavel's behavior wasn't confined to their private life. He began contacting Marta's friends, pressuring them with questions about her activities, her location, her companions. It was a web of control that extended far beyond the bounds of a normal relationship. By the middle of 2020, Marta had made a critical decision. She left their shared home and moved into a place of her own. It was an act of courage, one that marked the beginning of a new chapter. In her own space, Marta began to reclaim her joy. Her social media reflected this shift. Photos of gatherings, captions about healing, and affirmations of personal strength. In one notable post, she shared a photo of herself with a quote in Polish that read, "One of the worst mistakes a person can make is wasting years of life waiting for another person to change or develop." The words were powerful. A quiet, yet bold declaration that she was ready to step into her future on her own terms. In this new chapter, Marta began seeing someone, a work colleague who offered her kindness, stability, and respect. She was not rushing, but rather rediscovering what it meant to be cared for without condition. She was also planning ahead. Her goal was to formally end her marriage, filing for divorce back in Poland where the union had been registered. She began gathering the necessary paperwork and working with lawyers in Bydgoszcz. It was not a decision she made lightly, but one rooted in her desire to close a chapter that had turned dark. Even as Marta tried to move on, Pavel continued to reach out. He texted and called frequently, attempting to re-enter her life despite her clear requests to keep their contact limited. At times, his messages were pleading, at others, accusatory. Marta, firm in her boundaries, messaged him repeatedly asking him to leave her alone. Her words calm, direct, and resolute. Her family, particularly her brother and sister-in-law who lived nearby, became increasingly concerned. Marta confided in them about the strain she was under and the steps she was taking to protect her future. They offered her unwavering support, helping her emotionally and practically, and standing beside her every step of the way. Marta also leaned on her community. Friends invited her to dinners, joined her for gym workouts, and included her in group outings. Anything to remind her of the joy and normalcy she so deeply deserved. Those around her admired her strength, not just in breaking free, but in rebuilding with grace and determination. But Pavel was not letting go. His jealousy had become something deeper, harder to ignore. Despite Marta's efforts to create distance, he remained a presence, watching, reaching out, trying to hold on to a version of their past that no longer existed. By the autumn of 2021, Marta was standing at the edge of a new life. She was talking excitedly with friends about her upcoming Christmas trip to Poland. She looked forward to reuniting with her father, reconnecting with old friends, and celebrating the season with a sense of peace she had long missed. Her energy had returned. Her eyes sparkled again. On Friday, October 15, Marta spent the evening out with friends. They laughed, exchanged stories, and took photos together. It was one of those nights that seemed ordinary in the best of ways, full of light conversation and casual joy. Marta left the gathering around 10:40 p.m., dressed in her usual stylish way, her confidence fully restored. She appeared, by all accounts, like a woman in control of her own story again. But then, something shifted. When Marta didn't arrive for work on the morning of Monday, October 18th, concern spread almost instantly among her colleagues. She wasn't the kind of person to disappear without notice. Marta was dependable to a fault, the type of team member who would often arrive before anyone else, quietly make her rounds with a kind smile, and always lend a helping hand. She was consistent, responsible, and full of life, known not only for her professionalism, but for the quiet warmth that made the workplace a better, more human place to be. So, when her usual morning check-in didn't happen, people started to worry. Calls were made, texts were sent, but no one got a response. As the hours ticked by, that worry deepened. Marta's phone continued to ring unanswered, her social media remained inactive, and none of her usual contacts, not even her close friends, had heard from her since the end of the previous week. Her brother, who was used to chatting with her regularly, began to grow uneasy. He tried again and again to reach her. Still nothing. Then came the moment that shifted worry into dread. A text message, seemingly from Marta, arrived on the family's group chat. But something about it was off. It was overly polite, strangely detached, far too formal to be from someone who typically texted with emojis, nicknames, and little bursts of humor. Her sister-in-law stared at the screen, unsettled by what she was reading. The phrasing didn't sound like Marta. The tone was flat, mechanical. It lacked Marta's spark. The very thing that made her messages feel like a digital hug. She couldn't explain it exactly, but something in her gut told her that Marta hadn't written that message at all. And in that moment, her mind went to one person. Pavel. Pavel Chmielecka, Marta's ex-partner, had been part of the family's concern for a long time. There had been tension, emotional distance, a history that never sat quite right, especially in the last few months, as Marta had tried, carefully, cautiously, to separate from the relationship. Pavel, however, hadn't made that process easy. Fearing the worst and acting on instinct, Marta's sister-in-law drove to Pavel's residence on Wood Street. A quiet, modest room in a neighborhood that once felt unremarkable, even safe. But now even the air seemed different. Still, suspicious. Investigators pressed him during interviews. They asked about Marta's final weekend, about the delay in communication, about the eerie message sent from her phone, about why he hadn't contacted anyone. But Pavel gave them nothing, not even a word. That silence was, in some ways, one of the most disturbing elements of the entire investigation. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it might have hidden. Detectives worked tirelessly to reconstruct a timeline. Marta had last been seen alive on Friday evening, October 15th. From that moment onward, there were no further sightings, no public appearances, no check-ins, no calls. Just only that one deeply unsettling text message sent from her phone that had raised every red flag for her family. That text, oddly formal and missing Marta's usual warmth, became a central clue. It suggested something many feared but few wanted to say out loud, that someone else may have sent it in her place. The text wasn't just suspicious, it was strategic. Marta's brother and sister-in-law were overcome with grief. In hindsight, they acknowledged that Marta had done everything she could to distance herself from Pavel. They had urged her to stay away from him. She had made plans, found new love, and was working toward a future free of fear. Yet no one could have predicted the extent of Pavel's emotional collapse. nor the dangerous path his obsession would take. The investigation soon shifted from concern to confirmation as evidence began to mount. The breakthrough came through hard, digital facts. Security camera footage, digital forensics, and the chilling misuse of Marta's phone. These elements became the foundation of a case that would expose the deeply disturbing actions leading up to Marta's final moments. Northamptonshire police meticulously reviewed surveillance footage from the area surrounding Pavel's residence. Cameras from nearby homes, public streets, and local businesses were pulled for analysis. Among them were critical clips from October 15, the night Marta was last seen. That evening, Marta appeared to radiate a quiet, heartfelt happiness, the kind that only blossoms in the presence of true comfort and trusted companionship. Her smile was soft, almost reflective, as she lounged on the well-worn sofa in Daria's apartment in Woodland Court. It was a familiar space, warmly lit and cozy, filled with little signs of shared memories. Photos on the fridge, mismatched cushions, and the gentle background hum of evening television. Marta had spent many evenings here before. It was a kind of refuge, a place where she could simply be herself without judgment or pressure. On this particular night, she was especially at ease. She and Daria were catching up, something that had become a treasured ritual between them. They picked at leftovers, some pasta, a few spring rolls from the night before, while their phones buzzed occasionally beside them. The conversation meandered from workplace gossip to plans for spring, to dreams of travel and new possibilities. The season's arrival brought with it the idea of change, of renewal, and Marta welcomed it with open arms. Her laugh, easy and genuine, echoed in the small apartment. Marta's phone lit up more than usual that night. But these notifications weren't stressful. They weren't about work or family obligations. Instead, they came from Alexandra, a colleague with whom Marta had recently discovered something unexpected, something tender. Their connection had started out as a series of shared glances in the office, then casual texts, and now had grown into something deeper. Their exchanges were playful, affectionate, filled with inside jokes and subtle suggestions of a new, exciting chapter ahead. Yet, beneath this budding happiness, a shadow lingered, one that Marta could not entirely shake off. Her former partner, Pavel, had been contacting her with increasing frequency. Despite her repeated requests to be left alone, he continued to send her messages, one after the other, each one more pressing than the last. That evening, while she was trying to enjoy her time with Daria, he sent yet another series of texts. He asked her to come over. He wanted to see her, and curiously, he had a specific request. He asked her to bring pizza. Just the day before, Marta had made her stance painfully clear. She had told Pavel in no uncertain terms that their relationship was over, that she wanted distance and closure. She deserved peace. But Pavel was not listening. He persisted. And when direct messages didn't seem to be enough, he reached out to a mutual friend, subtly prying for information. When he discovered that Marta was at Daria's apartment that night, it was as though something clicked for him. A switch flipped. He now knew exactly where to find her. At 10:42 p.m., Marta gathered her things, said goodbye to Daria with a warm hug and a promise to text when she got home, and stepped out into the cool night air. The streets were quiet, the kind of stillness that belongs only to small towns at night. She walked with ease, her pace relaxed, her bag swinging lightly against her hip. Security footage from the neighborhood would later show her walking confidently down Wood Street, heading toward Rockingham Road, her silhouette outlined by streetlights. There was no indication of fear or unease, but just 3 minutes later, at 10:45 p.m., another figure emerged on camera. Pavel was seen leaving his rented room on Wood Street. Unlike Marta, he didn't linger or stroll. His walk was direct, determined. Surveillance would later trace his route toward Bath Road, a path that investigators would later believe was a deliberate attempt to intercept her. This wasn't coincidence. It was premeditated movement. At 10:56 p.m., both Marta and Pavel were recorded returning to his residence. They entered together, stepping through the narrow doorway of the shared housing unit. That footage would become a grim milestone, the last visual confirmation of Marta alive, her presence documented not by friends or family, but by a silent, unblinking security camera. What happened next would remain largely sealed behind closed doors. No neighbors reported hearing anything unusual, no loud noises, no calls for help. But digital traces began to reveal fragments of what might have occurred. At approximately 11 p.m., only minutes after they had entered, a photo was taken using Marta's phone. The timestamp was precise. Investigators would later suspect that this image was not innocent. It may have been used to manipulate perception, to create a misleading timeline. Then, around 12:30 a.m. on October 16th, roughly 90 minutes later, Pavel was again interacting with Marta's phone. This time, he was digging deeper. Screenshots were taken of private messages between Marta and Alexandra. For someone harboring unresolved feelings and emotional volatility, these messages would have struck a powerful chord. Investigators would later determine that Pavel's actions during this time weren't impulsive. They were calculated. He was cataloging evidence of her moving on. As the hours passed, a disturbing pattern began to take shape. Pavel began sending messages from Marta's phone, attempting to mimic her voice. These weren't heartfelt or natural. They were off-key. One message to Marta's family in particular stood out. It lacked her usual warmth. It was oddly formal, rigid, like someone trying too hard to imitate someone else. Her family noticed immediately. They sensed something was wrong. Deeply wrong. In the time that followed, Pavel continued this ruse. He messaged friends, reached out to acquaintances, even responded to Alexandra with vague reassurances. He was pretending that Marta was simply busy, just lying low, nothing to worry about. But underneath it all was a chilling reality, one that none of them yet fully understood. The following day, he kept up the act. He sent additional texts. He even used Marta's phone to communicate with men in her contacts list. Casual messages designed to maintain the illusion that she was still out in the world, alive and social. These digital impersonations were not the panicked work of someone who had made a terrible mistake. They were deliberate attempts to delay discovery, to control the narrative, to buy time. By the morning of October 17, 2021, just 2 days after Marta Chmielecki's life had come to a tragic and premature end, Pavel Chmielecki was seen on local CCTV footage, calmly walking to a corner shop not far from his rented room. There was no visible distress, no signs of emotional breakdown. The footage showed him purchasing 6 cans of beer and a single soft drink before casually returning to the very room where Marta remained. His demeanor was eerily normal, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. To the outside world, it was just another man going about his day in the quiet town of Kettering. But behind that everyday exterior was a haunting reality. This surveillance footage would later become a pivotal element in a case that shook the local community and made headlines across Northamptonshire and beyond. Prosecutors described Pavel's behavior in those days not as confused or panicked, but as calculating and cold. His motive, they said, was clear and deeply rooted in toxic jealousy and an inability to accept that Marta had moved on. Witnesses and friends testified that Pavel had told people he couldn't bear the idea of anyone else being close to her. An obsessive thought that escalated into a final, irreversible act of control. The legal proceedings moved forward swiftly once the investigation concluded. By March 3, 2022, Pavel Chmielecki stood before Northampton Crown Court and formally entered a guilty plea to the charge of murdering Marta. There would be no long, drawn-out trial. His admission meant the prosecution would not need to present every gruesome detail in court, and Marta's family would be spared the trauma of reliving the loss through cross-examinations and witness statements. Still, a sentencing hearing was scheduled for September 6, 2023. The courtroom that day was heavy with emotion. Journalists, members of the public, and law enforcement officials gathered to witness the culmination of a painful journey for Marta's loved ones. The case had drawn significant attention, not only for the brutality of the crime, but for the emotional weight it carried within the community. Marta's brother and sister-in-law were present, seated quietly among the crowd. Their faces, etched with months of grief, told a story of deep loss that words could barely express. As part of the proceedings, a family statement was prepared and read aloud in court. A tribute to the woman they had loved so dearly, and a reflection on the devastating void left behind. Marta was exceptional. She was full of life. She was kind, cheerful, helpful, and smart. You never had to ask her for help. She was always just there for us, whatever we needed. She loved our children and was a fantastic auntie to them both. Marta was definitely a daddy's girl too. They had such a bond and such a loving relationship. After her death, her father began stuttering and now finds it very hard to communicate at all. He has really suffered, as have we all. Marta had so many plans and dreams. She was independent and confident, and we loved her so much. It's never going to be the same without her. Losing Marta has changed our whole lives. Their words moved many in the courtroom to tears. It was more than an impact statement. It was a portrait of a woman who had meant everything to her family, a reminder of the life that was taken, not just the circumstances around it. During the hearing, prosecutors meticulously outlined the case against Pavel. They argued that what happened in that Wood Street room was not a spontaneous eruption of emotion, but a deliberate act built on months, if not years, of possessive behavior. The prosecution cited several prior incidents, all documented in court records. One in August 2020, another around Easter in 2021, and a third in September 2021, each illustrating Pavel's escalating aggression and refusal to accept boundaries. This was not a sudden loss of control, the prosecutor told the court. It was the culmination of a disturbing pattern of emotional manipulation, surveillance, and control. Judge David Herbert, who presided over the case, echoed that perspective in his sentencing remarks. He emphasized the enduring trauma left in her family's lives. It was a ferocious and selfish act, one that has left an unfillable hole in the lives of those who loved her, Judge Herbert said. The court also considered Pavel's behavior in the days following the crime. Not only did he remain in the same room with Marta for nearly 4 days, but he attempted to deceive family and friends by using her phone to send misleading messages. He made deliberate efforts to delay discovery, all while portraying himself to the outside world as unaffected. This, the prosecution emphasized, demonstrated a disturbing lack of remorse. When Pavel was finally interviewed, he showed no willingness to explain his actions. Instead, he remained silent, avoiding responsibility even as the evidence became overwhelming. The prosecution argued that this refusal to cooperate was another act of control, an attempt to shape the legal process in his favor. The defense, representing the 40-year-old Pavel with the assistance of a court-appointed interpreter, admitted there was little ground to defend. They acknowledged the horror of the crime, emphasizing that Pavel had entered a guilty plea and had not forced a trial. This, they said, should be seen as a small gesture of accountability. The defense argued that Pavel's actions were driven by intense emotional breakdown and personal crisis, claiming the act had not been premeditated in the legal sense, though they stopped short of asking for sympathy. Despite their efforts, these arguments rang hollow against the weight of the prosecution's timeline, the CCTV footage, the digital evidence, and the haunting silence Pavel had maintained since the day of Marta's death. Finally, after reviewing all arguments, Judge Herbert delivered the sentence. On September 6, 2023, Pavel Chmielecka was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 18 years and 4 months before he would even be eligible to apply for parole. At exactly 9:20 p.m., an event unfolded that would change everything in a matter of seconds. Without warning, something completely unforeseen took place. One of the two figures turned his focus directly toward Jodie. Without uttering a single word, he targeted her in an action that was as swift as it was silent. Almost immediately after the act, the two unknown individuals fled the scene, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Jodie's boyfriend, Eddie Coyle, stood frozen in disbelief. The shock of what had just occurred was overwhelming. As the gravity of the situation began to sink in, he instinctively reached for his phone and called emergency services. Paramedics and first responders arrived shortly afterward. They acted quickly. Their efforts were tireless and urgent, but despite their best attempts, The outcome was tragic. At 10:26 p.m., Jodie was officially pronounced dead. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Today, we're diving into a true crime story and exploring all the mysteries surrounding Jodie Chesney, who was born on June 18, 2000, and raised in the close-knit community of Dagenham, a working-class neighborhood tucked into the heart of East London. With its modest streets and a deep sense of community spirit, Dagenham was the kind of place where neighbors looked out for one another and where family bonds ran deep. It was in this grounded, supportive environment that Jodie's story began, one filled with laughter, ambition, compassion, and the love of those closest to her. Jodie was primarily raised by her father, Peter Chesney, a man whose devotion to his daughters was unwavering. After separating from Jodie's mother, Claire Gillam, when Jodie was just 6 years old, Peter stepped into the role of full-time parent with open arms and fierce determination. He became both mother and father to Jodie and her older sister Lucy, doing everything he could to provide them with the kind of nurturing and structured home life every child deserves. Despite the inevitable challenges that come with single parenting, Peter never let his daughters feel the absence of love or attention. Their household may not have been perfect, but it was full of warmth and deep affection. Peter once described Jodie as clingy in her early years, not in a difficult way, but in the innocent, endearing way of a young girl yearning for connection, trying to make sense of a world that had changed when her parents separated. She was shy, introspective, and often quiet, but always incredibly affectionate. That gentle shyness began to shift thanks to one particularly caring primary school teacher who saw something special in Jodie. With gentle encouragement, that teacher helped Jodie come out of her shell. Her confidence grew day by day, and slowly, the quiet little girl who used to stand back began stepping forward, revealing a spark of personality that would later shine so brightly. In 2012, when Jodie was 11 years old, her family life expanded in a beautiful way. Peter married Joanne, soon to become Jodie's beloved stepmother. Joanne entered their lives with kindness and patience, fully prepared to build something meaningful with Peter's daughters. What began as cautious steps soon blossomed into a true mother-daughter relationship between Joanne and Jodie. They bonded over shared routines and laughter, and over time, Joanne became an irreplaceable part of Jodie's emotional world. In a heartfelt post Jodie made online in 2013, she wrote, "Your mom is the person you grew up with, took care of you and listened to your problems. Jo is my mom, and nothing can change that." Those words were more than a message. They were a declaration of love and belonging. Joanne remembered those early days vividly, describing young Jodie as a child hungry for maternal connection. That need wasn't a weakness. It was a reflection of the depth of Jodie's heart and her capacity for love. Together, they built something genuine. Their home, modest but full of energy, echoed with Jodie's jokes and relentless playfulness. Joanne once jokingly referred to Jodie as a wind-up toy because of her seemingly endless energy and enthusiasm. Whether it was music, games, or simply hanging out, Jodie had a way of lighting up the room. Jodie found great joy and purpose in the Girl Scouts, which played a major role throughout her teenage years. She wasn't just a participant, she threw herself into it with passion and determination. She collected badges like treasures, climbed mountains with resilience, and paddled through lakes with her team, always smiling. These weren't just activities, they were expressions of who she was, brave, curious, and a natural leader. She was also a self-taught pianist, someone who could make a room fall silent with the soft, beautiful melodies she played. Her musical talent, much like her personality, was rooted in dedication. No one had to push her. She pushed herself, driven by a quiet inner fire. At the time of her final year at college, she was only 3 weeks away from completing her Gold Duke of Edinburgh Award, a prestigious achievement that speaks to a young person's leadership, service, and endurance. Academically, Jodie excelled at her college, where she was in her second year studying photography, psychology, and sociology. Her principal once described her as excellent, hardworking, and focused. Traits that reflected not just her academic performance, but the person she was becoming. Jodie wasn't driven by ambition alone. She genuinely cared about others. She dreamed of building a future around helping children or animals, careers rooted in empathy. As she matured, the once shy little girl became known for her booming laugh and unforgettable humor. Friends often said she could make anyone laugh until they cried, and she did it with ease. Her presence made every gathering better, and her kindness made every person feel included. Jodie shared a uniquely close bond with her older sister, Lucy. Just 2 years apart in age, the sisters were nearly inseparable, often described as two halves of a whole. They swapped secrets late into the night, supported each other during rough days, and laughed uncontrollably over inside jokes that only siblings could understand. Lucy said Jodie was the one person who always put others first, even when she didn't have to. Their Dagenham home was not only a place of family love, but also a gathering spot for Jodie's many friends. She had a magnetic personality and a natural gift for making people feel like they belonged. Even her dog, Woody, a lively Yorkshire Terrier, was part of her circle of comfort. Wherever Jodie went, Woody was never far behind, a small yet significant part of her joyful routine. Friday, March 1st, 2019, started off just like any other day. Jodie woke up in her family home, greeted by the familiar smells and sounds of the place she loved. It was her father Peter's 39th birthday, and the house was buzzing with quiet plans and cheerful anticipation. She'd been chatting with Joanne about possible gifts to get him. Nothing had been decided yet, but Jodie was eager to make it special. That morning, Jodie shared a heartfelt message on Instagram. Just after 8 a.m., she posted, "Happy birthday, Dad," accompanied by a heart emoji. It was simple, but full of love, a small digital hug on an important day. She then headed off to college for a full day of classes, carrying her usual subjects: photography, psychology, and sociology. As the school day wrapped up around 3 p.m., she left campus, her backpack casually slung over one shoulder, ready to begin the weekend. Back home in Dagenham, Jodie did one of her favorite things. She took Woody out for a walk. It was part of her daily rhythm, and neighbors often spotted her strolling through the area with a cheerful little dog by her side. By 4:30 p.m., she was back home again, catching up with Peter and Joanne, who were preparing for the evening's small birthday celebration. Jodie mentioned she had plans later and wouldn't be gone long. She grabbed her jacket, said her goodbyes, and left the house around 5:30 p.m., heading toward Romford railway station, just a short bus ride away. She was meeting up with her boyfriend, Eddie Coyle, and a small group of friends. By 6:30 p.m., the group, 6 teens in total, had gathered at Romford. Their chatter and laughter were briefly captured on surveillance footage as they moved through the area. Romford was their usual hangout, filled with familiar faces and favorite spots to grab a bite or catch up. But that evening, they decided to venture somewhere else. A peaceful green space known as Amy's Park in Harold Hill, not far from Havering College. At the park near St. Neo Road, there was a playground at its center and benches where teens hung out after dark. By the time the evening settled into darkness, it was just after 7:30 p.m., and Jodie Chesney and her group of close friends had gathered at their usual spot, a weathered picnic bench tucked. A small Bluetooth speaker played their favorite songs, casting a comforting soundtrack over the night air. At around 9 p.m., 2 individuals were spotted nearby by Jodie's friends. Their presence, at first, did not set off any alarm bells. Public parks are shared spaces, and it wasn't unusual to see people coming and going, especially on a Friday night. The figures didn't approach or engage the group. They lingered quietly at a distance, barely noticed amid the laughter and background music. After a brief pause, they disappeared back into the night, leaving behind nothing but a momentary glance and a passing shadow. No one gave it a second thought, but just 20 minutes later, at 9:20 p.m., those same figures reappeared. This time, their movements were noticeably different, calculated, direct, and focused. They approached with intent, cutting across the grass with urgency. According to later reports from the Metropolitan Police, the first individual was wearing dark-colored clothing and his face was partially concealed. The second person, less distinct in appearance, followed closely behind. In an event that unfolded in a matter of seconds, something completely unexpected occurred. The first figure directed his attention toward Jodie, targeting her without saying a word. The action was swift, silent, and deeply alarming. There was no exchange of words, no heated argument, just a brief moment that would alter countless lives forever. Almost as quickly as they had arrived, the two individuals fled the scene. They vanished into the night, their dark silhouettes swallowed by the shadows surrounding the park. Jodie's boyfriend, Eddie Coyle, was in disbelief. As the reality of what had just occurred set in, he reached for his phone and immediately dialed emergency services. His voice was panicked but urgent. He knew they needed help, and fast. Within minutes, a local man driving a van happened to pass by and saw the distressed group. Realizing something serious had occurred, he pulled over to assist, offering comfort and trying to help in any way he could. His presence was a brief but meaningful show of humanity in a moment of chaos. Emergency responders arrived shortly after. Paramedics did everything within their power, working swiftly and tirelessly to stabilize the situation. Despite their heroic efforts, Jodie was sadly pronounced deceased at 10:26 p.m. Police cordoned off the area with tape as a forensic team began their investigation. What had been a carefree evening became the center of a serious inquiry. Jodie's friends remained at the scene, emotionally shaken, recounting the night's events to officers with as much clarity as they could muster through their shock. According to their accounts, there had been no confrontation, no signs of trouble, and no warnings. What happened was unexpected and seemed entirely unprovoked, which made it all the more difficult to comprehend. The Metropolitan Police's Homicide and Major Crime Command, a unit specialized in investigating serious crimes, immediately took control of the investigation. Acting Detective Chief Superintendent John Ross addressed the public with a somber message stating, "Her death is a tragedy that should never have happened. We are determined to find those responsible and urge anyone with information to come forward." As investigators delved deeper, they began piecing together Jodie's final hours through a combination of witness interviews, digital records, and surveillance footage. Her timeline was carefully reconstructed. From the moment she left her home in Dagenham to her arrival at Romford Station, to the time she and her friends settled into Amy's Park. Each detail was vital in understanding what occurred and who may have been involved. A major breakthrough came shortly after. A local resident contacted police with a crucial tip. On the evening of the incident, he had seen two individuals running out of the park and climbing into a black vehicle, which then sped away. According to this witness, there was already someone in the driver's seat, indicating at least 3 individuals were involved. This testimony gave the investigation its first significant lead. CCTV became one of the key tools in the case. Harold Hill, like many parts of London, had a network of public and private security cameras that captured small slices of life throughout the borough. Officers gathered and reviewed extensive footage from nearby streets, hoping to identify suspects or the vehicle involved. By March 2, just one day after the incident, investigators located surveillance footage showing 2 males leaving Amy's Park at approximately 9:25 p.m. One individual wore a dark jacket with a distinctive design on the back, while the second wore a hoodie, their faces difficult to distinguish. The video also captured the presence of a black vehicle consistent with the one described by the witness. The very next day, March 3rd, police made their first arrest. A 20-year-old man named Manuel Petrovich was taken into custody. Investigators discovered that the black car seen near the scene was registered to him. When questioned, Petrovich denied any involvement. He claimed his car had been taken from him in a separate incident, a robbery, he said. However, Petrovich was hesitant to share names. He explained that he feared for his own safety and that of his family, stating that individuals had already come to his home looking for him. His silence raised more questions than answers. During further interviews, Petrovich provided a limited account of his whereabouts on the night in question. He said he had been spending time with a friend when they received a phone call from a man, later referred to as Man 1. The caller requested a ride. Petrovich and his friend drove to meet him, picking him up along with a second person, Man 2. The 4 men then traveled to Harold Hill, where Man 1 allegedly said he needed to collect some money. According to Petrovich, Man 1 and Man 2 exited the car near the park, leaving him and his friend behind. He claimed they were gone no more than 5 minutes. When they returned, he noted, their behavior didn't raise any suspicion. He described them as calm and gave no indication that anything unusual had taken place. He added that neither man appeared to be carrying anything of interest or acting in a way that stood out. Later that night, Petrovich said his car keys were taken by force from him by another male. The next day, when news broke of the incident in Harold Hill, Petrovich reportedly felt a deep sense of unease. "I hoped it wasn't related to why I was in the area," he told officers. Detectives continued to follow the trail. A second suspect, a 19-year-old man, was identified based on detailed descriptions provided by witnesses who had seen someone matching his appearance in the area. To avoid tipping him off while they gathered further evidence, investigators referred to him only as the suspect in early reports. But the investigation didn't stop there. By March 5th, just a few days after the incident, 2 additional men, aged 30 and 38, were arrested in nearby Romford. They were suspected of having played supporting roles in the events, possibly helping the primary individuals either before or after the incident occurred. A 50-year-old man was taken into custody under suspicion of assisting those involved, allegedly helping dispose of key items related to the case. However, after a brief detainment and lack of sufficient evidence, he was soon released. His role remained under review, but unconfirmed. Detective Chief Inspector Dave Wells, leading the investigation, made a telling public statement during a press briefing. "We're looking at a network here," he said, his tone serious and resolute. "This is not about 1 or 2 isolated individuals. This is broader." His words hinted at a deeper, potentially organized structure behind what had occurred, an undercurrent of activity that investigators were determined to uncover. Meanwhile, neighbors near Ratford Road, an area already under police scrutiny, were adding their voices to the growing body of intelligence. A woman in her 40s, who lived directly across from a flat that had recently been raided, shared her concerns with officers. She reported seeing unfamiliar individuals coming and going at odd hours, especially late at night. "It just didn't feel right," she told police. "People arriving in cars, staying only minutes, and leaving again. It wasn't the usual foot traffic you expect in a residential neighborhood." Her account added weight to suspicions that the flat was being used for activities unrelated to daily living. These statements, along with mounting digital and forensic evidence, began to shape the theory of motive. While Jodie had no personal connection to criminal groups or known troublemakers, detectives began to hypothesize that her group might have been mistaken for others. One theory suggested that the attack was linked to a territorial misunderstanding or a conflict unrelated to Jodie herself. The idea that she could have been an unintended victim only deepened the sense of tragedy. Still, not every arrest led to a breakthrough. The 2 older men detained earlier in connection with the case, aged 30 and 38, were eventually released. Police cited insufficient evidence and emphasized that the investigation was still evolving. Though their roles remained unclear, they were no longer considered primary suspects. By March 10, 9 days after the heartbreaking loss of Jodie Chesney, the investigation gained new momentum. Acting on an anonymous but credible tip-off, officers from the Metropolitan Police's Homicide and Major Crime Command targeted a residential property on Rogers Road in Dagenham. The address was linked to a relative of Aaron Isaacs, believed to be Man 2. Along with Senseless Attack, suspected to be Man 1, both were thought to be lying low at the location, staying out of public view in the days following the incident. At exactly 7 p.m., a highly coordinated team of armed officers moved in. Their body-worn cameras recorded every moment, ensuring transparency and safety during the high-stakes operation. What unfolded was as dramatic as it was unexpected, like a scene from a tightly choreographed police drama. In a moment of panic, Senseless Attack, 19 at the time, attempted a frantic escape. He clambered over a rear-facing flat roof, only to misstep and crash through the glass ceiling of a conservatory below. In video footage later shared by the Metropolitan Police, a visibly stunned and disoriented Attack was placed in handcuffs. As officers read him his rights, he protested, "What? Murder? I didn't kill anyone." His response was immediate and defensive, a sign of either confusion or calculated denial. During a search of the residence, officers found a jacket matching the one worn by one of the individuals captured on CCTV the night of the incident. Further inspection of Akwi's mobile phone revealed a number of incriminating messages, conversations with Manuel Petrovich and references to planned activity in Amy's park, just hours before the attack. The digital footprint was difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, Aaron Isaacs, just 18, had tried to slip away through a window, but police were already positioned around the perimeter. He was quickly apprehended in the back garden, where he had abandoned a backpack. Inside the bag, officers found a few seemingly random items: a large knife, 2 toothbrushes, and a canister of hair mousse. While unusual, these objects were logged as potential evidence, especially given the presence of the weapon. Investigators later confirmed that the knife bore similarities to a type often referred to in urban crime contexts, notable for its appearance, but more importantly, for its relevance to the ongoing case. The presence of personal grooming items suggested an attempt to flee or lay low for an extended period. Investigators now focused on tying the suspects together. Petrovic had already been under scrutiny due to CCTV footage placing his black car near Amy's park on the night of the incident. The vehicle had been seen circling nearby and was believed to have transported both Isaacs and Akwi to the scene. Though Petrovic claimed his car had been taken under duress and he had no knowledge of a plan, the connections were mounting. By the time the investigation reached May, formal charges were brought against 3 individuals. Anga Akwi and Aaron Isaacs were charged with the most serious offense. Petrovic were charged with a combination of serious charges, including both primary and secondary liability for the incident. The earlier detainees, a 50-year-old man and a 38-year-old woman, were questioned for potentially helping offenders, but were released under investigation. As more came to light, a fuller picture of the individuals involved began to emerge. Born on March 29, 2000, Senseless Anga Akwi grew up in Harold Hill, not far from the very park where the tragedy occurred. Raised primarily by his mother alongside 4 sisters, Anga's childhood was marked by emotional turbulence and the absence of a father figure. His father, originally from Belgium, had been absent throughout his upbringing. Their only known meeting came in 2015 when Anga was already in his mid-teens, a fleeting reunion that didn't result in a lasting relationship. At 17, Anga was forced to leave home due to repeated clashes with family members. He moved into a supported housing facility in Romford, a hostel managed by social services, designed for at-risk youth. His past included legal trouble. In 2018, he was handed a 6-week suspended sentence after being caught in possession of stolen jewelry. That sentence had since been breached. In police interviews, Akwi admitted to being at Amy's park on the night of the incident. However, he claimed he was simply taking a walk and had not participated in any wrongdoing. When pressed, he deflected responsibility toward Aaron Isaacs, saying, "He's the one who lost his head." It was a denial wrapped in accusation, designed to cast doubt and shift blame. Aaron Isaacs, born on January 27, 2001, was younger but known to law enforcement. He lived in a small flat in Barking with his mother and younger brother. His early life had been challenging. As later noted by Judge Wendy Joseph at the Old Bailey, his mother had long struggled with serious mental health issues. Aaron had been on the radar of children's services since the age of 4, a sobering detail that hinted at years of instability. By the time of his arrest, Isaacs had accumulated a criminal history that included possession of a weapon and involvement in vehicle-related offenses. When questioned by police, Isaacs remained firm in his denial. "I didn't touch her," he told investigators. He acknowledged that he had been with Anga that evening, but claimed he was unaware of any plans. He explained that he ran because he was afraid and confused by what had just taken place. As for Manuel Petrovich, the alleged driver, was a 20-year-old Romford local. Though he kept a low profile, those familiar with the situation described him as a close and trusted associate of Anga Akwi. Friends and witnesses suggested that he had often made his car available for jobs, a term typically used to reference local errands or unsanctioned outings that often involved risky behavior, though the nature of these activities remained unclear. His connection to the case intensified when, during a conversation that took place while he was in custody, later obtained legally by prosecutors, Manuel Petrovich was overheard admitting that he had prior knowledge of Anga's intentions that night. In the recorded exchange, Petrovich stated that Anga had spoken to him about seeking retribution on individuals he believed had wronged him at Amy's Park weeks earlier. Using coded language, he claimed the group they were looking for had done something to Anga months before, and that this outing was intended to settle that score. They chefed him up, Petrovich said, slang used locally to imply a past altercation. Despite this, Petrovich was adamant that he had no knowledge of an act taking place that night. He maintained that he remained in the vehicle throughout and only learned the outcome of the incident after the others returned to the car. When questioned directly, he continued to deny that he had any intention to cause harm or that he knew Jodie or anyone in her group was in danger. In his version of events, they had mistaken Jodie's friend group for rivals who regularly spent time in the same part of the park. Meanwhile, in the days following the incident, Anga Akwi, fully aware that authorities would be pursuing leads, took deliberate and calculated steps to erase any trace of his involvement. He burned most of the clothes he wore that evening, reportedly destroying them in a backyard fire. But for reasons unclear, he kept his jacket. This proved to be a costly mistake. The knife handle allegedly used in the attack was never recovered, suggesting it too had been deliberately discarded. Isaacs, for his part, disposed of his own clothing as well. Together, they fled to Dagenham, taking refuge in a residence believed to be connected to Isaac's extended family. When brought in for questioning, both suspects took familiar paths: deflection, denial, and blame. Anga insisted that he never committed the attack himself, claiming instead that he acted merely as a lookout. Isaacs, however, countered that narrative, telling investigators he hadn't agreed to any plan and had no idea things would escalate. Each sought to shift responsibility, but digital forensics, DNA trace analysis on the jacket, and mobile phone records painted a very different picture, one of premeditated action and joint accountability. CCTV evidence clearly showed the suspects in and around Amy's Park during the relevant time frame. The vehicle used matched Petrovich's black car, while mobile phone records indicated coordinated communication between the trio. The police believed these exchanges involved discussions about the job Anga had referenced, the culmination of a personal grudge that tragically ensnared an innocent bystander. What made the crime so haunting was its senselessness. Jodie Chesney had no connection to the feud that cost her life. She was simply present in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Back in Harold Hill, the community struggled to make sense of what had occurred. Local vigils sprang up within days, and purple ribbons, a color chosen by Jodie's family, began appearing across lampposts, fences, and scout halls throughout East London. Her father, Peter Chesney, found both purpose and strength in channeling his grief into action. He launched the Jodie Chesney Foundation, a registered charity focused on keeping young people away from criminal influence and offering education-based programs that promote positive choices. On the foundation's website, Peter wrote, "Jodie was a beautiful person who judged no one and loved everyone. The best way to honor her is to prevent this from happening again." The foundation became a symbol of resilience and love in the wake of tragedy. Community events, Scout-led memorials, and youth awareness campaigns were held in her honor. Many who had never met Jodie attended, drawn by the warmth of her legacy and the need to stand against senseless violence. The trial of the three primary defendants began on September 17, 2019, at the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, better known as the Old Bailey. This courthouse, steeped in legal history, has overseen some of the nation's most serious criminal cases. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with emotion. Jodie's family, Father Peter, stepmother Joanne, and older sister Lucy, attended nearly every day of proceedings. Each of them wore purple ribbons as a quiet but powerful symbol of remembrance. "I wanted them to see what they'd done to us," Joanne later said, her voice resolute even in the face of immeasurable loss. Her presence, like Peter's, was not just about mourning, it was about seeking truth. The prosecution was led by Crispin Aylett KC, a seasoned barrister representing the Crown. In his opening statement, Aylett told jurors that Jodie was the embodiment of innocence in the wrong place at the wrong time. He explained that she was likely mistaken for rivals targeted by the defendants, people who had previously frequented Amy's park and had no relation to Jodie or her friends. The evidence, he said, pointed clearly to a coordinated effort. Alet presented a body of evidence that included surveillance footage of Petrovich's black car near the park, phone records showing communication between the defendants before and after the event, and the jacket found at Akwi's residence. He also referenced the prison conversation in which Petrovich admitted the group had banged on the wrong people, meaning they had targeted the wrong individuals. The defense teams responded forcefully, each working to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. Charles Sherrard K.C., representing Anga Akwi, acknowledged that his client had been in the park but denied he had harmed Jodie. He claimed Isaacs was the attacker and pointed to clothing discrepancies, highlighting that Akwi wore a white hoodie and gray tracksuit, not the black clothing described by some witnesses. Sarah Forshaw K.C., speaking for Petrovich, maintained that her client was simply a driver and had no knowledge of the plan. Natasha Wong, Isaac's defense counsel, portrayed her client as a follower, not a leader. She insisted he carried no weapon and wasn't aware of any intent to hurt someone. Still, the Crown's case was difficult to refute. Jodie's boyfriend Eddie Coyle gave detailed testimony of the events that night. Forensic experts testified about the material evidence, and officers described the arrests and subsequent investigations. Over 45 hours of testimony were heard before the jury was sent to deliberate. On November 7, 2019, the verdict was read aloud. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned their decision. Anga Akwi and Aaron Isaacs were found guilty of murder. Manuel Petrovich, despite the prosecution's arguments, was acquitted of all charges, a result that left Jodie's family stunned, but reflected the jury's assessment of intent and involvement. Sentencing took place on November 18th. The presiding judge ruled that Akwi, believed to be the one who inflicted the fatal harm, would serve life in prison with a minimum term of 26 years. Isaacs, described as an active participant who enabled the crime, was also sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 18 years before eligibility for parole. Logan Canyon, a remote and rugged stretch of wilderness located nearly 85 miles north of Salt Lake City. It was a vast, heavily forested region, scenic in daylight, daunting at night. Detectives understood the significance immediately. No one drives nearly 2 hours into the mountains without a reason. Despite the overwhelming scale of the terrain, their search did not drag on for long. Down by the river, tucked beneath a thick tangle of overgrowth, they found something. Items burned and left behind. These items were not just clues. They were unmistakable confirmations that McKenzie had been there. The fire had failed to erase her presence. DNA evidence, coupled with eyewitness reports and digital data, began weaving a chilling and undeniable picture. In the heart of a wooded area, McKenzie Lewick was finally found. Unfortunately, it was already too late. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. McKenzie Lewick was just 23 years old. Originally from the beachside city of El Segundo, California, she was the second of 4 children in the Lewick family and their only daughter. Growing up sandwiched between 3 brothers might have intimidated some, but not McKenzie. It shaped her into someone vibrant, competitive, and full of energy. She carved out her identity in a household filled with laughter, rivalry, and love. She was her parents' shining light, spirited, compassionate, and endlessly determined. McKenzie's love for athletics was more than just a hobby. It was a cornerstone of her personality. She embraced physical activity with the kind of devotion that spoke of both joy and discipline. Whether she was cycling for miles down the California coast, dominating the lanes in competitive swimming, charging across the water polo pool, or sitting in the stands as a spirited supporter of her school's football team, McKenzie lived and breathed sports. Her commitment went beyond play. She understood the strength and focus it took to balance team loyalty, physical stamina, and the responsibility of performance. When it came time for college, McKenzie, while deeply attached to her California roots, longed to stretch her wings and experience life beyond the familiar. Seeking both distance and growth, she ultimately chose the University of Utah, a full 700 miles away from the world she knew. There, she embarked on a double academic track, majoring in kinesiology and pre-nursing while minoring in health studies. Her ambition wasn't just academic. It was driven by a desire to help others. McKenzie dreamed of a career in healthcare, aiming to heal and uplift those in need. Her time in Utah was intense and deeply immersive. She joined Alpha Chi Omega, a sorority that would become a huge part of her social and philanthropic life. This wasn't just a sisterhood for McKenzie, it became a second family. But being part of the sorority came with high expectations. Members had to maintain a minimum 2.5 GPA and contribute to community service projects. On top of her rigorous studies and sorority responsibilities, McKenzie also held down 2 jobs. Her life became a whirlwind of lectures, work shifts, volunteer hours, and social commitments. Her days were packed to the brim, leaving little time for rest. But that's how McKenzie preferred it. She thrived in the hustle, rarely complained, and always had a smile on her face. By her 3rd year, however, even McKenzie recognized the need to slow down just a bit. She made the decision to drop to part-time status, entering her senior year with fewer classes. She found comfort and independence in her cozy off-campus townhouse, which she shared not with roommates, but with a small collection of beloved pets, hedgehogs, guinea pigs, and cats. Her deep affection for animals was something her friends always admired. One of her closest friends, Nova, recalled with amusement how McKenzie once threw an elaborate birthday party for one of her cats, also named Nova, complete with champagne for her human guests, a cat food cake, and colorful party hats. Everyone played along because McKenzie made the absurd seem delightful. Her sorority sister Kennedy described McKenzie as someone with an instinct to care for others. She was, in Kennedy's words, a nurturer through and through. Even in the most stressful times, McKenzie was the first to cook a warm meal, offer a ride, or bring over a drink with a reassuring word. She always wanted to make sure everyone around her was okay, Kennedy remembered. She just got joy from giving, whether that meant food, comfort, or laughter. And she was always smiling. So much so that when she had braces, her smile would sometimes cut into her lips, but she never let it stop her. That's how much she smiled. But as summer approached in 2019, a personal tragedy cast a heavy shadow over her usually sunny demeanor. McKenzie's grandmother, someone she was exceptionally close to, passed away. The loss hit her hard. Though she didn't talk about it constantly, those around her could sense the emotional weight she was carrying. In mid-June, she returned to Los Angeles to attend the funeral, surrounded by family, grief, and the complex emotions that come with saying goodbye to someone irreplaceable. After the service, McKenzie boarded a flight back to Salt Lake City on the night of June 16th. At exactly 1 a.m. on June 17th, she touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport. Still emotionally raw and physically drained, she reached for her phone and sent a message to her mother, Diana. Landed. Love you, Mama. It was short, affectionate, and typical of McKenzie. But what should have been the start of a return to her routine would instead mark the beginning of a mystery that would leave friends, family, and investigators deeply unsettled. Around 2 a.m., she appeared to be trying to find transportation, possibly using Uber or another ride-hailing app. Her mother texted back, but this time, the usual blue iMessage bubble turned green. It was a subtle but potentially significant change. A green message could mean many things. Perhaps McKenzie's battery had died, or her phone had switched to SMS due to poor signal. Still, her mom waited for a reply that never came. At first, no one panicked. McKenzie had a habit of staying busy, and with everything she had going on, the funeral, school, work, it didn't seem unusual that she might need time to decompress. Friends assumed she was overwhelmed, possibly sleeping or just taking a break from communication. But as the hours turned into an entire day, and then into 2, people began to grow uneasy. Her friend Kennedy noticed early signs that something wasn't right. McKenzie wasn't opening her Snapchats, an app she used frequently. There were no Instagram posts, no new messages, and no signs that she was active online at all. It was unlike her to stay completely silent. Even in her busiest moments, she usually sent a quick message or reaction. Kennedy felt a pit forming in her stomach. Something was off, deeply off. On June 20th, 3 days after Mackenzie's last message, her father, Greg, could no longer bear the silence. With growing dread, he requested a welfare check. He told the authorities he hadn't heard from his daughter and that her phone kept going straight to voicemail. She hadn't contacted anyone, hadn't returned to work, and had missed several key events, including an important exam and a close friend's wedding back home in California. Officers were dispatched to Mackenzie's townhouse. Her car was in the driveway, just as it should be, but no one answered the door. They peered through the windows but saw no signs of activity. The house was eerily still. Police began contacting her circle of friends, employers, and university officials. Slowly, a troubling pattern began to form. Mackenzie hadn't shown up for work. She'd missed university obligations. No one had seen her. Not in person, not online, not anywhere. Nearly a full week had passed since her flight landed. The usual theories, burnout, emotional retreat, phone troubles, no longer made sense. This wasn't just someone taking a break. It was beginning to look like something far more serious had happened. The search intensified. Investigators reviewed airport surveillance footage. Mackenzie could clearly be seen exiting the plane. She looked tired but calm. She walked alone, collected her luggage, and exited the terminal. There was no one waiting for her. No one seemed to follow her. She didn't stop to talk to anyone. The footage raised more questions than it answered. How could someone disappear from a busy international airport in the age of constant connectivity and digital footprints? Where had Mackenzie gone after she left the airport? Who had she intended to meet, if anyone? And why had all contact ceased so abruptly? Roughly 40 minutes after Mackenzie Lick's flight touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport in the early hours of June 17, 2019, she ordered a Lyft ride. It was a choice that, in hindsight, would become the last known movement in a series of decisions that left her family, friends, and law enforcement puzzled and desperate for answers. The ride took her to Hatch Park, a quiet public space located approximately 9 miles from her off-campus townhouse. It was not a place Mackenzie had ever been known to frequent. Friends and family were immediately struck by how out of character the destination was. According to those close to her, Mackenzie had no connections to that part of town, and certainly no known reason to visit the park, especially in the middle of the night. Even those who knew her best were at a loss to explain it. Her parents, still processing the grief of her grandmother's funeral, which Mackenzie had just flown home to attend, were the last to hear from her. She had texted them with a quick, reassuring update that she had landed safely. There were no signs of distress or unusual concern in the message. But shortly after that, she disappeared from contact entirely. Lyft, the rideshare company that transported her that night, later confirmed they were actively cooperating with law enforcement. They stated there were no known issues or unusual incidents during Mackenzie's ride. According to the company's internal trip data and the driver's statement, Mackenzie had been dropped off safely, and the driver continued on to his next pickups without delay. Everything about the ride on the surface seemed ordinary. But that, of course, was the problem. Nothing else that followed was ordinary. The Lick family, originally from Southern California, found themselves having to push hard for answers. They sought legal assistance to obtain subpoenas for Mackenzie's phone records, hoping the data would shed light on her last known activities and communications. Meanwhile, the Lyft driver was located and interviewed. He recounted that Mackenzie appeared calm, alert, and fully in control during the ride. She even acknowledged that Hatch Park seemed like an odd place to be dropped off at that hour, but she told him she was meeting someone. She didn't specify who. What stood out to the driver, and later to investigators, was that Mackenzie made no effort to conceal the peculiarity of her destination. She was still texting someone during the drive, and while the driver thought the destination strange, her demeanor was composed. She showed no visible signs of being upset, afraid, or distressed. She had luggage, which he helped unload upon arrival. As he was doing so, he noticed a car already parked in the lot. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a vague, shadowy figure step out of that vehicle. Due to the darkness and distance, he couldn't provide a clear description. It was merely a blurred silhouette. But what he could say was this. As he returned to his car, he heard voices. Mackenzie and the unknown person speaking. Nothing about the conversation seemed hostile. There were no raised voices, no signs of an argument or fear. If anything, it sounded like a meeting that had been expected, perhaps even planned in advance. The driver pulled away, unaware that he had just been the last verified person to see Mackenzie Lick. Investigators verified the driver's story using GPS data, dash cam information, and phone records. His route checked out completely, and police were confident that he was not involved in Mackenzie's disappearance. Still, troubling questions remained. Who was the figure in the car? And what did Mackenzie intend when she asked to be taken to such a secluded location in the middle of the night? As the days passed with no word from Mackenzie, her friends and family's concern grew into deep anxiety. Authorities, however, initially stated that they had no evidence of foul play. This cautious stance frustrated those closest to her. Mackenzie wasn't the kind of person to vanish without warning. Her life was full of responsibilities: school, work, pets, relationships. She would never walk away from it all without saying a word. Soon, large groups of volunteers, including her sorority sisters, classmates, and community members, began organizing daily flyer distributions. They worked tirelessly, handing out missing person posters to every car that passed, speaking to media outlets, and maintaining a visible presence on the streets of Salt Lake City. Posters with Mackenzie's face and the haunting question, "Have you seen Mackenzie?" started appearing on poles, walls, and windows throughout the area. Then came a twist no one expected. A man named Rob, who came forward as a casual acquaintance, told police he and a friend had randomly met Mackenzie at a local bar not long before her disappearance. The encounter occurred days prior to June 17th. According to Rob, Mackenzie had been friendly, upbeat, and conversational. They shared drinks and spoke for close to an hour. During their conversation, Mackenzie revealed something that was news to everyone else in her life. She had recently joined a dating platform. Rob said she didn't offer too many specifics about what she was looking for, but she made it clear that she had moved on from 2 serious past relationships and was open to meeting new people. For her friends and family, this revelation came as a complete surprise. None of them knew she was using online dating, and the idea that she may have met someone from that platform the night she disappeared cast an entirely new light on the investigation. Rob later discovered Mackenzie's profile on the same dating app. The last recorded activity on her account? June 16, the night before she went missing. This new information opened an unexpected and potentially crucial door in the case. Police began reviewing her online presence more closely. They found that there had been no activity on her phone after her last known text. Her social media remained dormant. Her bank accounts had not been used. She hadn't touched any of her usual services or subscriptions, but a financial review uncovered something startling. The plane tickets for her trip to Los Angeles had been purchased by a man she met through the dating site. Not only that, but investigators discovered a separate bank account in Mackenzie's name, one her family hadn't known existed. Into that account, a $300 deposit had been made by another individual who was, at the time, completely unknown to them. Greg Lick, her father, told investigators he was shocked to discover the second bank account. It was not the kind of secrecy he associated with his daughter. Using this lead, authorities began piecing together her digital trail, tracing contacts from her dating profile, examining her phone records, and digging into her recent social media behavior. Among the many pieces of digital evidence collected in the early days of the investigation, one particular discovery stood out. It would prove to be a turning point. Investigators determined that Mackenzie Lick had recently followed a relatively obscure Instagram page, one that was not widely known or connected to her established circle of friends and acquaintances. This page, innocuous at first glance, ultimately served as a digital breadcrumb that led authorities to a curious detail. Mackenzie had been exchanging messages with a phone number that wasn't saved in her contacts. The number had only appeared in her communication records days before her sudden disappearance. Detectives quickly traced the number to a residence in Salt Lake City, Utah. That home belonged to a man named Ayula Ajayi, someone who had not previously surfaced in the investigation. Known to acquaintances by the nickname AJ, Ajayi's name began to show up with increasing frequency in connection to the case. Ajayi was a 31-year-old man who lived only a short distance from Hatch Park. the last known location where McKenzie had been seen. On paper, he was an unlikely suspect. His public persona was that of a well-spoken, educated individual with a career in technology. Officially, he worked as a support analyst for Dell, a role that conveyed stability and professionalism. But there was more to AJ than his resume suggested. He also marketed himself as a part-time model, showcasing photos on social media that presented him as confident, stylish, and upwardly mobile. At a glance, nothing about Ayoola Ajayi's life seemed overtly suspicious. If anything, the life he curated online projected an image of calculated normalcy. He was recently divorced, seemingly introverted, and lived in a modest house in the Fair Park neighborhood of Salt Lake City, a diverse, residential area known for its quiet streets and sense of community. He had no known criminal record. To neighbors and co-workers, he was polite, reserved, and appeared to be focused on his career and personal goals. Yet sometimes, the most unsettling truths hide behind the mask of normalcy. Ajayi's home, which he shared with several housemates, didn't raise any immediate alarms. He occasionally rented out the basement through Airbnb, which, at first, appeared to account for the transient traffic at the property. He claimed this helped cover expenses while allowing him to meet new people from across the country. Yet when investigators began to dig deeper, the details of his life began to fray at the edges. At the time McKenzie vanished, investigators had little more than fragments: text logs, location pings, and the faint trail of her last known movements. But those fragments soon formed a pattern, and that pattern began to center on one name: Ayoola Ajayi. Ajayi came to the United States on a student visa, seeking opportunity and a fresh start. He enrolled at Utah State University, though his academic record revealed a sporadic and inconsistent attendance. He eventually secured a green card, allowing him to stay in the U.S. permanently. But it was clear that AJ was someone who frequently shifted his ambitions and reinvented his narrative, depending on who was listening. While he told people he worked in tech, there were periods of unaccounted time. Online, he posted glamorous photos and even hinted at dreams of fame. Yet he was also a man of contradictions. Beneath the polished social media presence and carefully maintained persona was a darker, less coherent reality. One particularly disturbing clue came in the form of a manuscript. Investigators learned that AJ had written a novel, unpublished, but available in draft form. The book followed a young man entangled in a morally ambiguous world, witnessing violence and wrestling with the choice to embrace a life of crime. While fiction by nature, the manuscript carried an unsettling tone, one that felt less like artistic exploration and more like a personal outlet. As investigators read through its pages, certain themes began to feel eerily aligned with the facts of their case. There were also personal accounts that painted a troubling picture. AJ had been divorced not long before the events in question. His ex-wife, who had since relocated to Dallas, described him to authorities as someone who instilled in her a deep and enduring sense of fear. She chose her words carefully, but firmly. She had cut ties completely, stating that she did not feel safe around him and had no intention of reestablishing any contact. Her testimony would later support the growing theory that AJ's behavior behind closed doors contrasted sharply with his public demeanor. Adding to the list of red flags, a police report from January 2019, just months before McKenzie's disappearance, surfaced. It detailed an incident in which AJ had been investigated for a possible assault involving another woman. Though charges were never filed and the case did not proceed to court, the documentation revealed allegations of coercive and aggressive behavior. It painted a picture of someone who may have had a pattern of troubling conduct, slipping through the cracks due to a lack of formal prosecution. When detectives finally questioned AJ about Mackenzie Lick, his reaction was firm and absolute denial. He stated unequivocally that he had never met her, had never heard of her, and certainly never communicated with her. When pressed about the matching phone number found in her text logs, he offered an explanation that felt oddly rehearsed. He suggested the messages might have originated from a guest staying in his Airbnb rental, implying he had little control over who used his home phone or Wi-Fi network. The story, while technically possible, lacked credibility, and investigators knew it. Then came a revelation that significantly altered the course of the investigation. Brian Wolf, a local contractor and handyman, came forward with a highly unusual account. Months earlier, he said, AJ had hired him for what he assumed would be a standard remodeling job. But the details quickly took a strange turn. AJ asked Wolf to construct a hidden room within his house. Not just any hidden room, but one designed with very specific and very unsettling features. The request included soundproof walls, reinforced with insulation and padding. The door was to be concealed and accessible only via a biometric thumbprint scanner. Everything about the project screamed secrecy and control. AJ had emphasized that the room needed to be completed quickly. When Brian asked why the project required such secrecy and urgency, AJ gave him an answer that immediately raised suspicion. He said it was to store alcohol away from his girlfriend, who was religious and didn't approve of drinking. While McKenzie had been raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, she was not a practicing member as an adult. Whether she was the woman AJ was referring to remained unclear. Brian felt something was wrong. The reasons he gave me just didn't make any sense, he later told investigators. The whole thing felt off. I had a bad gut feeling about it. He and his nephew, who had joined him for the job estimate, both agreed. They weren't going to take the job. We got in the truck, Brian recalled, and I said, "That was weird, right?" And my nephew goes, "Yeah, that was hella weird. We knew right then, we're not doing this." Though the project never moved forward, AJ continued messaging Brian, pressing him to reconsider. The insistence added to the growing unease around AJ's intentions. Then came the first major shift in AJ's account. Without prompting, AJ voluntarily walked into the police station. This time, his story changed. He admitted that he had, in fact, communicated with McKenzie, contradicting his earlier statement. He claimed that they had messaged briefly after connecting through an online platform. According to AJ, she stopped responding to him after he sent her some photos of himself. "I figured maybe she wasn't interested in my type," he said. "So, I left it alone." This admission was enough. Detectives had what they needed to request a search warrant for AJ's home. When police arrived to execute the search, what they found was alarming. AJ's mattress was missing from the house. The smell of strong cleaning agents, most notably bleach, filled the air. Surveillance cameras were installed in nearly every room. The setup was not standard security. It felt excessive, almost obsessive. His basement tenants were temporarily removed from the property while the search was conducted. AJ stood nearby on the sidewalk, watching quietly as officers moved through his home, noting details, collecting evidence, and photographing the layout. As police expanded their search, one of AJ's neighbors approached them. The neighbor recalled that around the time McKenzie went missing, they had smelled something strange in the air, something unpleasant and out of place. When they looked outside, they saw AJ pouring gasoline around a specific area of his backyard. The neighbor led police to the spot. There, behind AJ's property line, they found what was left of a fire pit, and more. Burnt clothing and a charred cell phone lay partially buried in the ashes. A large hole had also been dug nearby, recently filled in. When a specially trained K9 was brought in to assist, the dog immediately alerted to the area. It laid down at the site, a signal used to indicate the possible presence of human scent. Not long after, AJ was found sitting on a bench at a nearby park. He was brought in for a second, more focused interview. This time, police had more than theories. They had a growing mountain of circumstantial evidence. In the following days, digital forensics tied even more threads together. McKenzie's and AJ's cell phones both pinged the same tower near Hatch Park, at the exact same time. They had arrived within a minute of one another. Security footage later confirmed that AJ's car entered the park at precisely 2:48 a.m. At 2:59 a.m., McKenzie's final text message was sent. And then, silence. Her phone powered down at that very minute and was never turned on again. AJ's own phone showed he returned home by 3 a.m. Still, AJ maintained his innocence. He told officers they were wasting their time focusing on him. He insisted they would soon realize it was a dead end. As the investigation into Mackenzie Lueck's disappearance intensified, so too did the pressure on Ayoola Ajayi, the man who had quickly become the central figure in the case. The confidence that once cloaked him, a cold, calculated calm that unsettled even the most seasoned investigators, was beginning to crack. The weight of mounting evidence, shifting witness statements, and the media's increasing scrutiny was clearly beginning to wear him down. Then AJ's phone yielded a critical clue. Just one day after McKenzie had last been seen, just one day after she got into his vehicle in the early hours of June 17, AJ had taken a trip to Logan Canyon, a remote and rugged stretch of wilderness located nearly 85 miles north of Salt Lake City. It was a vast, heavily forested region, scenic in daylight, daunting at night, and it quickly became the next target of the investigation. Detectives understood the significance immediately. No one drives nearly 2 hours into the mountains without a reason. Despite the overwhelming scale of the terrain, their search did not drag on for long. Down by the river, tucked beneath a thick tangle of overgrowth, they found something. Items burned and left behind. Among the ashes and debris were the charred remains of McKenzie's purse, her personal bag, her official identification cards, and fragments of clothing consistent with what she had been wearing. These items were not just clues. They were unmistakable confirmations that McKenzie had been there. The fire had failed to erase her presence. DNA evidence, coupled with eyewitness reports and digital data, began weaving a chilling and undeniable picture. Investigators later confirmed that items found in AJ's home, clothing, burned materials, and several unidentifiable personal objects, were also tied directly to McKenzie. The chain of evidence was growing, and it was tightening around AJ with every new discovery. In the heart of a wooded area, Mackenzie Lueck was finally found. It was the heartbreaking conclusion to a weeks-long nightmare. The girl who had inspired such fierce love, who had sparked rallies and daily searches, had been silenced. There would be no reunion, no welcome home, only grief, and the determination for justice. Police quickly moved in and arrested 31-year-old Ayoola Ajayi. He was taken into custody on suspicion of the kidnapping and murder of Mackenzie Lueck. At his initial court appearance, which lasted just 2 minutes, he did not enter a plea. But he had no need to speak. The case against him was already overwhelming. Prosecutors had accumulated a damning array of physical, digital, and testimonial evidence. AJ's former wife, who had long feared him, told prosecutors she was willing, without hesitation, to testify against him in court. Her revulsion at what he had done was unmistakable. As the possibility of the death penalty became more than just a threat, AJ changed course. He entered a guilty plea to the charge of aggravated murder, thus avoiding trial and capital sentencing. As part of the plea deal, prosecutors dropped some of the additional charges, including aggravated kidnapping and obstruction of justice. However, the plea also resolved unrelated charges from 2 other pending criminal cases, ensuring AJ would face the full weight of accountability. In total, Ajayi faced 19 felony counts, ranging from violent crimes to various digital and financial offenses. Some of these charges were tied to content found on his personal devices, evidence that painted an even darker picture of his online behavior and disturbing intentions. In court, AJ stood before Mackenzie's parents, Greg and Diana Lueck, and offered a statement. His words were simple but heavy with implication. "I'm sorry for what I did," he said. "I deserve what I'm gonna get. I know this won't bring her back." It was a final admission from a man who had, from the start, denied everything. What remained, even after all the facts had been uncovered, was one question that no one, neither prosecutors, investigators, nor psychologists, could answer. Why? According to the district attorney, most homicide cases present clear motives: financial gain, jealousy, revenge, or perceived betrayal. But this case defied those patterns. There was no history, no relationship, no emotional entanglement. Mackenzie had never met AJ in person until the day of her disappearance. And yet, AJ later admitted in court that he had planned her death before he ever picked her up that night. The details of that morning were not recounted in court. Out of respect for the family and to prevent unnecessary trauma, many specifics were left sealed in records. What was known, however, was that the moment they returned to his home, AJ executed the plan he had already formed. a plan that ended McKenzie's life. In the end, Ayoola Ajayi was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never be free again. The sentence reflected the severity of his crimes and ensured that he would never have the opportunity to harm another person. The criminal process was over, but the wounds it left were far from healed. The Lueck family, who had once filled their days with conversations, FaceTime calls, holiday planning, and silly pet birthday parties, were left only with memories. In a moment of grace and sorrow, the judge addressed the family saying, "We are blessed and honored to have McKenzie in our lives for the last 23 years. The pain of losing her was evident in every word spoken in court. Each of the 3 most serious criminal charges, aggravated murder and obstruction of justice, would be served consecutively." From the early hours of the morning, search officers assembled at the site, moving with quiet determination and practiced coordination. They worked in rotating shifts, each team meticulously carrying out their duties. Shortly after the initial digging commenced, the team unearthed an object buried just beneath the surface. It was a wooden structure, deliberately crafted, aged but intact. But the search did not end there. Recognizing the potential significance of the find, the team widened the excavation area. Then came a second discovery, one that brought the operation to a heavy, silent pause. They had found her. The location and clothing were consistent with the missing woman. Everyone hoped for another explanation, but deep down, they already knew. Later, identifying features were examined. The results were confirmed. It was Valerie Tindle. Dear viewers, we appreciate your support and comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you for being with us. In this documentary, we investigate a real crime involving Valerie Tindle, who was born in 2005 in the heart of Indianapolis, the bustling capital city of Indiana. From the very beginning, Valerie's life was rooted in the contrasts between city energy and small-town calm. Her parents, Jack and Shayna Tindle, always prioritized family safety above all else. With 5 children to raise, including Valerie, their 3rd child, they found the unpredictability of the city increasingly unsettling. Jack worked as a mechanic, and Shayna had a part-time job at a community health clinic. They both began to worry about their eldest son soon needing to commute across town for middle school. The thought of him navigating crowded buses, walking past unfamiliar faces, and spending hours away from home led them to make a decisive change. After thoughtful discussions and long nights poring over maps and options, they agreed. It was time to move. From a young age, Valerie displayed a deep connection to animals. While other children her age might have gravitated toward dolls or video games, she preferred feeding chickens, brushing ponies, and reading books about animal care. Local farmers soon noticed her enthusiasm, and she was often invited to tag along during feeding time or watch veterinary checkups. Her parents supported her dream wholeheartedly. Jack would sometimes bring home used textbooks from a nearby college library sale, and Shayna signed her up for summer animal care workshops whenever they were available. Valerie's bedroom was filled with notebooks, posters of animal anatomy, and a growing collection of pet care supplies. Even though their financial situation was modest, the Tindles made sure Valerie always had access to learning opportunities. By 2023, Valerie had just completed her junior year at Eastfield High School. At 18, she was looking ahead to her final year before college. She had already begun researching veterinary programs, drafting application essays, and attending virtual open houses. Realizing that tuition, supplies, and travel expenses would add up quickly, she made a practical decision: to use her summer break to earn and save money. Her initial attempt at employment was typical for teens in rural areas. She landed a position at a nearby fast food restaurant. But it wasn't long before she realized it wasn't the right fit. The long hours, constant noise, and intense pace drained her energy and left little room for the focus she wanted to maintain on her academic goals. After only a few weeks, she gave her notice and resumed her search. It was during this time that a trusted friend offered an alternative. A neighbor named Patrick, an elderly man well known throughout Arlington, ran a small but steady yard maintenance business. He had been retired for several years, but continued offering services like lawn mowing, garden shed repairs, and seasonal cleanup. Valerie had known Patrick nearly all her life. He was her best friend's grandfather, a kind-hearted man with a warm smile and a reputation for honesty. Their families often spent holidays together, and Patrick had watched Valerie grow up from a little girl chasing butterflies to a thoughtful young woman planning her future. When Patrick offered her a part-time job helping him out, the opportunity seemed perfect. The work was peaceful and outdoors, the hours were flexible, and the location was always nearby. Most importantly, she felt completely safe. Her parents agreed, and Valerie began joining Patrick a few mornings each week, doing light physical tasks and earning modest wages that she immediately tucked away into her savings jar. On the morning of June 7th, 2023, nothing seemed out of the ordinary at the Tindle home. The day began like any other summer morning. Birds chirped outside the windows, sunlight spilled through the kitchen curtains, and the smell of toast and coffee filled the air. Valerie got up at her usual time, dressed in casual summer clothes, shorts, a t-shirt, and comfortable shoes, and came downstairs to join her family for breakfast. She was in good spirits, smiling and relaxed as she chatted with her mother and younger siblings. She mentioned she'd be heading out shortly to assist Patrick with a few minor yard tasks. It didn't seem like anything strenuous, just some pruning and raking, she said. She expected to be home by lunch. She took only the essentials with her phone, her wallet, her keys, no backpack, no water bottle, no extra change of clothes or tools. That wasn't unusual. Most jobs with Patrick were local and brief. As she left the house, she waved to her little brother on the swing and told her mom, "See you in a few hours." For most of the day, everything remained calm. The Tindles were used to Valerie being gone for several hours during yard jobs, especially when the sun was out and there was more work than usual. Her mother, Shayna, occupied herself with errands and chores, occasionally glancing at the clock but never feeling uneasy. Valerie had always been responsible. If she was running late, she would send a text or give a quick call. But by the late afternoon, approaching 5 p.m., something began to feel off. Valerie had said she'd return around noon. Shayna picked up her phone and dialed Valerie's number, hoping to hear her daughter's cheerful voice. But the call didn't connect. It went straight to voicemail. That was out of character for Valerie. If she said she would do something, she followed through. If she was delayed or sidetracked, she always made the effort to communicate, even with a quick text. So, when her mother, Shayna Tindle, realized that her daughter hadn't called or messaged for hours, she instinctively knew something was off. Still trying to maintain a calm head, she decided to reach out to the person Valerie was supposed to be with that day, Patrick, an elderly neighbor and longtime friend of the family. The Tindles trusted Patrick implicitly. He had been part of their lives for years, attending birthday cookouts, helping with home repairs, and offering his old pickup truck whenever someone needed to move furniture or haul supplies. Shayna dialed his number and waited. When Patrick answered, his voice was casual and friendly at first. But that changed quickly after she asked him the question that had been weighing on her all afternoon. "Was Valerie working with you today?" There was a pause. Then came Patrick's reply, and it was like a slow crack splitting open the solid ground beneath her. He sounded genuinely confused and told her that he hadn't scheduled anything with Valerie that day. In fact, he said he hadn't seen her since the previous afternoon. He went on to mention, almost in passing, that he had heard she might be planning a day trip to Indianapolis with some friends. Where that information came from, he didn't say. Shayna froze. The mention of Indianapolis didn't match anything Valerie had talked about. That morning, her daughter had been specific and clear. She was going to help Patrick with yard work, the kind of task she had done many times before. There was no mention of travel, no hints of other commitments, no indication that anything was different. Valerie had left the house dressed for light work in the sun, not for a trip out of town. And something else didn't make sense. Valerie didn't keep things from her family. The Tindle household had always functioned on open communication and mutual respect. If Valerie had changed her plans, she would have said so. When Jack Tindle walked through the door just after 6 p.m., tired from another long day at the auto shop, Shayna met him with more than just a worried expression. She carried the full weight of a mother's growing dread. She explained everything: the unanswered calls, the conversation with Patrick, the conflicting story. Jack listened, processing the information piece by piece. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he nodded slowly and without hesitation said, "We need to start looking." The two parents began going over every possible explanation. Maybe Valerie had changed her mind at the last minute. Maybe she had met someone else and decided to help them instead. Maybe her phone had died while she was still out working, and she simply lost track of time. But each possibility raised more questions than it answered. Why wouldn't she let them know? Why tell one story and then do something completely different? By 6:30 p.m., the search began. Jack and Shayna walked the neighborhood, calling out their daughter's name. They checked places Valerie sometimes visited: the community garden, the local park with its single swing set, the creek trail behind the Hanson farm. They knocked on the doors of close friends, hoping someone had seen her or had some idea of her plans. No one had. Not one person had seen Valerie after that morning. No one had heard her mention a trip, an event, or a change of schedule. As the sun dipped lower, word began to spread. Arlington wasn't the kind of town where news moved slowly. It flowed like water. Neighbors called each other, dropped by unannounced, and rallied without needing to be asked. By 7 p.m., a small crowd had started to form at the Tindle home. Friends came offering help. Others arrived simply to be present, sensing the seriousness of the moment. Among them were Patrick and his wife, who appeared calm and composed. Patrick repeated the same version of events he had told Shayna earlier. He hadn't seen Valerie, and he had no idea where she might be. His calm demeanor didn't offer much comfort. In fact, it unsettled Jack more than he cared to admit. This was someone they had known for years, someone who had always seemed trustworthy. But now, faced with Valerie's unexplained disappearance and a vague story about a supposed trip, Jack couldn't help but feel the first stirrings of suspicion. Still, they held back their fears. This was no time for accusations. It was time for action. As night fell, the atmosphere around the Tindle home turned somber. Inside, the family sat in quiet disbelief, staring at the front door, hoping at any moment it might open. By midnight, the decision was made. Valerie was officially reported missing. The report was filed with the Rush County Sheriff's Department, and with that single step, the case transitioned from a private family worry to a full-scale public investigation. Initially, there was little to go on. Officers reviewed Shayna's statement carefully, noting the timeline and the inconsistencies. Valerie's phone had been off for hours. There was no message, no signal ping, no digital trail to trace. And then there was the contradiction between what Valerie had told her mother and what Patrick had claimed. That discrepancy stood out immediately. Despite the rural setting, Arlington's law enforcement took swift action. Valerie's name was added to the county's incident system within hours. Officers began reaching out to her classmates, teachers, and friends. They interviewed anyone who had seen her in the past 48 hours. Questions focused on Valerie's mood, her behavior, and whether she had mentioned anything unusual. But across the board, the answers were the same. Valerie hadn't said a word about going anywhere special on June 7th. No trip, no big plans, no indication that something was different about that day. Officers also searched her room. Everything was just as it had been that morning. Her phone charger was plugged in by the nightstand. Her makeup and hairbrush were neatly arranged. That ruled out the idea that she had planned to leave on her own. Valerie's phone had been off since the middle of the day on June 7th. Investigators tracked the final ping from her phone to a signal tower located within Arlington, not far from the center of town. It registered at approximately 11:42 a.m. on June 7th, 2023. The morning she told her mother she'd be out doing light yard work for a neighbor. After that, the signal stopped cold. There were no further pings, no network reconnections, no evidence that the phone had moved or been powered back on. It simply went dark. These digital dead end raised immediate questions. The most logical conclusion was also the most unsettling. The phone never left Arlington. It hadn't roamed outside the cell tower's reach, nor had it reappeared on another network in a neighboring town or city. And that pointed to one thing. Wherever Valerie had gone, she hadn't left her hometown. At least, not by ordinary means. Another piece of the puzzle was her car, a green 2000 Honda Accord. It was missing as well. The assumption was that Valerie had taken it, yet none of the town's few traffic or security cameras captured her vehicle leaving the area. With so few roads out of Arlington, that seemed odd. Surveillance along the main intersections showed no footage of her vehicle. It was as if both she and the car had quietly evaporated. As the hours wore on, the disappearance began to draw broader attention. By the morning of June 8th, Valerie's case was no longer just a local concern. It had become statewide news. Flyers were printed and distributed. Her school portrait was broadcast on the morning news. Her face, framed with shoulder-length dark blonde hair, eyes full of life and curiosity, was now seen on every major social media platform in Indiana. Law enforcement held a press briefing that day. Their tone was measured but serious. Officials stated clearly that they had no evidence to suggest Valerie had left willingly. The case was now considered one of concern, potential endangerment. That announcement shifted public perception. What had started as a missing person case took on the gravity of a possible abduction or worse. And the town of Arlington responded. With heart, with urgency. Within hours, dozens of residents took to the fields, woods, and gravel paths with flashlights, walking sticks, and bottled water. Volunteers canvassed the area in coordinated teams, aided by law enforcement. Residents checked their barns and sheds. Others opened crawl spaces and attics. Nothing was considered too unlikely. Local farmers paused their own work to allow searchers onto their properties, and small business owners donated supplies and food. Soon, neighboring towns got involved. People from as far as Shelbyville and Greenfield arrived with ATVs, search dogs. K-9 units scanned forest edges and creeks. Helicopters flew overhead, equipped with infrared. The community had mobilized in full, displaying an overwhelming wave of concern and compassion. Despite the massive search effort, no signs of Valerie or her vehicle were found. Not a scrap of clothing, not a piece of trash, not a cell phone. The silence of her absence deepened. It was as though the ground itself had swallowed her whole. Parallel to the ground operations, the Rush County Sheriff's Department launched a deeper investigation. Officers secured digital warrants for Valerie's online accounts, with full permission from her parents. They combed through every text, every post, every call log and email. Nothing raised alarm. Her texts were upbeat and full of typical teenage banter. School projects, future college hopes, plans for the weekend. There were no signs of emotional distress, no messages that hinted at fear, regret, or a desire to disappear. Her search history included topics related to animal care, exam schedules, and secondhand bookstores. Not exactly the digital footprints of someone preparing to run away. Still, investigators pressed on. It was during this deeper review that certain inconsistencies began to surface. Subtle at first, then more defined. One detail in particular drew renewed attention. Valerie's last conversation with her mother had centered around her plan to work for Patrick, the older gentleman who lived nearby and who had occasionally hired her to help with small outdoor projects. Patrick, on his part, initially told authorities that he hadn't seen Valerie at all that day. In fact, when Shayna first called him, he appeared caught off guard. He reiterated that no work had been scheduled for that morning and went on to suggest that Valerie might have taken a spontaneous trip to Indianapolis with friends. Still, at that early stage, his name wasn't attached to the investigation in any official way. He was simply another figure in Valerie's day-to-day life, a neighbor, an employer, and the grandfather of one of her closest friends. But privately, Shayna harbored doubts. And they didn't stem only from Patrick's statements. In the weeks leading up to her daughter's disappearance, Shayna had noticed subtle but unsettling changes in Patrick's behavior. He had taken more interest in Valerie than seemed appropriate for a man his age. He frequently offered her rides, even for short distances she could walk. He asked detailed questions about her daily plans, where she would be, how long she'd be gone, and who she'd be with. At first, it had seemed like harmless concern from an older man looking out for someone he'd known since childhood. But over time, it began to feel intrusive. Then came a more troubling discovery. Valerie had shared her phone's location with Patrick. When Shayna found out, Valerie explained that it was just a safety measure. that Patrick used the same feature to keep track of his granddaughter. But that explanation didn't sit right with her mother. Still, Valerie hadn't seemed uncomfortable. And without proof of anything inappropriate, Shayna tried to suppress her unease. But now, with Valerie missing, all those little things took on new weight. On the third day of the investigation, Patrick was brought in for an official police interview. He maintained his earlier story. He hadn't seen Valerie, they had no scheduled plans, and he believed she might have traveled out of town. He reiterated that the idea came from a conversation with his granddaughter. But when police spoke with the granddaughter directly, her account sharply contradicted his. She had never talked to Valerie on June 7th. In fact, she hadn't spoken with her at all that week. She also said she had no idea about any trip to Indianapolis, and certainly hadn't shared such a detail with her grandfather. That discrepancy caught investigators' attention. Soon after, Patrick was asked to come in for a second interview. This time, his story changed, dramatically. Now he claimed that he had seen Valerie that day. According to this new version, Patrick now claimed that he and Valerie had, in fact, intended to complete a yard maintenance job on the morning of June 7th, but that the work plan had somehow fallen through. He didn't provide specific reasons, only vague comments about scheduling or weather. What happened next, he said, was unexpected. Valerie allegedly asked him for a ride to a neighboring town. He claimed she didn't say why, only that she needed to be dropped off at a particular location and that it wasn't far. Patrick stated that he agreed and drove her to the spot they had agreed on. Once she got out of the vehicle, he claimed he turned around and left immediately. This sudden shift in his narrative sent up red flags for law enforcement. When asked directly why he hadn't mentioned any of this in his first statement, when he had plainly said he hadn't seen her at all that day, Patrick responded with something investigators had heard many times before. He was afraid of being blamed and didn't want to draw suspicion. But his explanation didn't sit right. The inconsistency, combined with his unwillingness to share this supposedly innocent version earlier, raised serious concerns. Detectives interpreted the revised account not as a nervous omission, but as a deliberate effort to mislead investigators during the critical early hours of the case. With cause to suspect deception, authorities acted on what they had. Patrick was temporarily detained under suspicion of providing false information in an active investigation. It was a procedural step, important, but limited in scope. Legally, the charge wasn't strong enough to hold him long-term. After a short time in custody and following standard bail conditions, Patrick was released pending further developments. However, everything had changed. At this point, he was no longer viewed as a cooperative witness. He was now the primary person of interest. Following this shift in focus, law enforcement began verifying every detail Patrick had provided in both his original and revised statements. They began re-interviewing witnesses and re-examining the timeline, hoping to establish a more reliable chain of events. And that's when new voices started to emerge. A neighbor living just 2 houses down from Patrick reported seeing him behind the wheel of a car matching the description of Valerie's green 2000 Honda Accord, not his usual vehicle, sometime late that morning. The sighting had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now took on significant weight. 2 more witnesses came forward, both stating they had seen Patrick and Valerie walking together that same day along a tree-lined stretch of road near the town's southern edge. These accounts directly contradicted his initial denial of seeing her on June 7th and poked major holes in his second version as well. Meanwhile, search teams continued combing the surrounding areas, and a major development occurred a few days after these statements were collected. Valerie's missing Honda Accord was located in a quiet residential neighborhood several miles outside of Arlington. The vehicle had been deliberately parked on a side street, away from main traffic flow and public parking areas. Most notably, the license plates had been removed. At first glance, the car showed no visible signs of damage or a struggle. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, and nothing obviously left behind in the seats or trunk. But the vehicle's sudden reappearance, after days of it being completely off the radar, and the missing plates suggested intentional concealment, this gave law enforcement a stronger footing. Attention quickly turned back to his property. Around this time, specialized K-9 units were brought in to aid the investigation. The trained search dogs were directed to the area surrounding Patrick's house, with particular focus on the backyard, the tree line, and several man-made features, including a small decorative pond near the far end of the property. During the initial search sweep, the dogs displayed heightened sensitivity to a particular section near the water feature. They returned to that same area repeatedly, behavior that typically indicates the detection of biological markers or buried material. However, despite the canine responses, investigators hit a wall. In legal terms, a dog alert, on its own, is not considered conclusive evidence. It can raise suspicion, but it's not enough to secure a search warrant. There were no visible signs of tampering with the ground, and no physical evidence was found during the surface-level inspection. At this point, investigators shifted their strategy. Knowing that something potentially crucial could be buried beneath Patrick's yard, they began discreet surveillance of the property. Undercover vehicles parked on nearby streets. Detectives began documenting every action taken in and around the lot. What they observed over the next several weeks raised even more questions. Patrick, who had otherwise been keeping a low profile since his release, was seen performing odd tasks around his property. Most notably, he began digging, frequently and in different parts of the yard. At times, he would spend hours outside under the pretense of gardening or landscaping. But the locations of his digging appeared random and unusual, far from any flower beds or garden structures. In several cases, he was seen covering the fresh soil with construction rubble, wooden boards, or bags of mulch. Investigators photographed and recorded each instance, gradually building a dossier of suspicious post-incident behavior. Parallel to this, detectives began reviewing the role of Patrick's wife, Linda. Although she lived in the home and was presumably present during key timeframes, she had neither volunteered to speak with police nor been called in for questioning. She hadn't made a single public comment about Valerie's disappearance. While there was no evidence directly implicating her in anything, investigators believed she might possess knowledge or observations that could help clarify the situation. Meanwhile, forensic and technical experts were called in to pursue an alternate route. If traditional legal thresholds couldn't yet be met, perhaps technology could help. Investigators opted to use non-invasive scanning methods to gather further data about the property's underground structure. Topographic and ground-penetrating radar scans were initiated, tools capable of detecting subsurface inconsistencies without digging. The scan results were revealing. One particular zone near the pond returned irregular data. Soil that appeared recently disturbed, with disrupted layers and uneven compaction. Beneath that, a rectangular formation stood out against the natural pattern of the ground. The anomaly was dense, symmetrical, and inconsistent with native soil content. Experts marked it as a priority for physical examination. Armed with this new data, combined with video surveillance, contradictory witness statements, the hidden vehicle, and the behavioral patterns documented over time, investigators submitted a formal request for a warrant to search Patrick's property. The court reviewed the full compilation of evidence and approved the request. On the morning of November 28, 2023, the investigative team received official authorization to search the premises. The search began at the exact location where scanning technology had previously identified irregularities in the ground composition, an area not far from the artificial pond that had already drawn the attention of K9 units. The digging was methodical. Officers worked in coordinated shifts, pausing often to photograph layers, collect soil samples, and document each stage of the excavation. Not long after breaking ground, the team uncovered what appeared to be a carefully constructed wooden container, partially buried and shielded beneath layers of compacted earth and debris. The box was weathered, but intact. Its dimensions and construction immediately signaled to investigators that it had not been discarded carelessly. It had been deliberately concealed. The team didn't stop there. They continued to excavate, gradually expanding the area and widening the search zone. Several hours later, they made a second, far more sobering discovery. They found her. Though no immediate confirmation could be made at the scene, there was a quiet, grim certainty shared among the officers and forensic specialists present. The location and clothing were consistent with the missing woman. Everyone hoped for another explanation, but deep down, they already knew. Later, dental records and identifying features were examined. The results were confirmed. It was Valerie Tindle. Later that same day, law enforcement officers returned to Patrick's home with a different purpose. He was placed under arrest without incident and taken into custody. The charge: connection to the death and concealment of evidence. As standard procedure, investigators then conducted an extensive top-to-bottom search of Patrick's residence and the surrounding property. Cabinets were opened, devices were seized, outbuildings were inspected. Every effort was made to uncover any additional evidence that might shed light on Valerie's final hours. But despite the thoroughness of the sweep, no new physical evidence was recovered. There were no diaries, no electronic traces, and no items that directly connected the crime to a larger plot or third party. At the time of his arrest, Patrick's wife, Linda, was also living at the residence. However, she was not detained, nor was she publicly named in connection with the case. Although her proximity to the property raised questions for investigators, there was no conclusive evidence tying her to the crime. As such, no formal action was taken against her, and Patrick remained the only person facing legal accountability. Back at the station, Patrick was brought in for formal questioning. Initially, his demeanor remained unchanged. He denied all wrongdoing, avoided direct answers, and insisted that he had no idea how Valerie had ended up on his land. Detectives kept their composure. They had spent months preparing for this moment, and they pressed gently but firmly, focusing on the human impact, the grief endured by Valerie's parents, the unanswered questions in the community, the need for truth and closure. Still, he offered nothing. No expression of guilt, no indication of sorrow, not even when his wife's name was mentioned. Then came the pivotal shift. Investigators turned to the most incontrovertible piece of evidence they now possessed: the location of Valerie. They asked him directly, "Can you explain how she ended up on your territory?" There was a long silence. The air in the room seemed to still. And then, with a heavy sigh and a subtle shift in posture, Patrick spoke. He said he was ready to tell the truth. According to his account, the entire incident had been a tragic accident, not the result of premeditated action. He claimed that on the morning of June 7th, Valerie had come to his home unexpectedly, not for yard work, but to demand money. He alleged she was trying to pressure him into giving her a sum of cash, and when he refused, the confrontation escalated. He insisted that what followed was unintentional and unfolded too quickly for him to react. He maintained that panic, not malice, guided his decisions afterward. But investigators found the account deeply questionable. Furthermore, Patrick's multiple conflicting statements over the past months undercut his credibility. His first version claimed he hadn't seen her at all. The second placed her at his house briefly. The third involved a car ride. And now, a supposed accident. In their professional judgment, detectives saw his latest confession as another attempt to mitigate his responsibility. While he had now acknowledged a connection to Valerie's death, he continued to deny any form of intent, especially premeditated intent. Still, the confession marked a legal milestone. With a location, a partial admission, and a tangled web of contradictory accounts, the evidence was sufficient to proceed. Once the full case was compiled, law enforcement handed the materials over to prosecutors. In March 2024, after consultations with his legal counsel and discussions with the state, he agreed to a plea deal. Under the terms of the agreement, he formally admitted to causing Valerie Tindle's death and unlawfully concealing. In exchange for his cooperation and waiver of a trial, he received a sentence of 57 years in prison, with no eligibility for parole.